In the early hours of this morning, Tuesday, 4th February the year 2020, at about 5:20 a.m., the longest-serving President of the Republic of Kenya, and indeed Kenya's second President, passed on peacefully in the presence of his family and close friends. Now, in whichever way you want to look at it, there is no doubt that Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi had a huge impact on the country called Kenya. Now, one of the bizarre African traditions is never to talk ill of the dead. And personally, I find this unacceptable. Because when somebody passes on, whatever is done and said about that departed soul is not for the late. Yeah, they're gone. Everything is for those left behind, and especially the lessons from the life of that man that those left behind can learn from. Now, how are they going to learn anything if you don't tell the truth? And so, in the tradition of this channel, this is going to be a brutally honest analysis of the life of Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. My intention is not to offend anybody, and my apologies in advance. My whole objective is for us to understand and to learn lessons for a better Kenya. A very honest and candid summary of Moi would be as follows: the accidental politician, the accidental president, who ended up as an accidental legend. When Moi was born in Sacho, Kabarak village, Baringo County, in 1924, it was very rare for anybody to go to school. But fate had other ideas. This happened, some of them devastating to the young Moi, that all combined so that Moi found himself in school. He had, of course, been born Toroitich Moi, or Toroitich Arap Moi, which means Toroitich, the son of Moi. And when he was only 4 years old, his father passed on. And he ended up being brought up by a relative, I believe his uncle. Now, at the tender age of 4, somebody is looking for love and attention and direction in their lives, which can only be provided by parents, biological parents, or extraordinarily caring and understanding foster parents of sorts. Moi had neither, and this kind of explains his attraction to Christianity and the love and caring of servants of God at that time and brethren. And he ended up being brought up as a staunch Christian deep in the AIC church, and he was later baptized and given the name Daniel. And his missionary teachers soon discovered that Moi was a fast learner. Contrary to what he may have seemed at first sight, looks often deceive. And this is something that was to serve Moi very well, as far as survival is concerned, all his life. And I'm referring to the fact that people would always greatly underestimate his intelligence. And Moi became a teacher, and soon his image of the smartly dressed teacher, always smartly dressed, and polite teacher who did not talk much, began to emerge in the village. He was tall and therefore difficult to miss, even where the ladies were concerned, if you know what I mean. And in 1950, he got married to a very beautiful lass called Helena Bomet. And Moi started a family. And I'm sure there must have been some people in that village who started writing Moi's entire biography. A very predictable biography, and a very boring one at that. But fate had different ideas, and destiny started moving very rapidly to completely change the life of this humble school teacher. And it all started with the story of a drunkard. You see, the colonial administration in that area were looking for a local leader, the equivalent of a chief today, but with a much larger jurisdiction. Much earlier, they had picked a man who had now become a problem. Dr. John Oletameno was a drunkard. Some people said he was an alcoholic, which would have probably been okay at any other time. But this was 1955, at the height of the state of emergency, when the colonial government was fighting the Mau Mau rebels, or Mau Mau freedom fighters. And the greatest concern was that Dr. Tameno was not only a drunkard, but they suspected he was sympathetic to the freedom fighters. He had to go, and he had to go very quickly. And so in this crisis, somebody remembered the tall, polite, staunch Christian who was always walking around the village, a school teacher. And the Mzungus quickly sent for him. And that is how Moi's political journey started. Accidentally. It is said Moi dived into his new responsibilities with a lot of aggression, crisscrossing the vast Rift Valley to fulfill his duties as the chief on behalf of the colonial government for the region. But he had hardly settled in when more drama came knocking. Drama of the life-changing kind. The wind of change was sweeping right across Africa. And in 1957, there was scheduled to be an election countrywide of the very first African elected members to parliament in those days, which was called the Legco. And of course, there was no way you were going to participate in those elections without the approval of the local colonial administration. And of course, Moi got that approval very quickly. And just like that, the humble school teacher ended up on the national political stage at a very critical time in the history of the country. The humble school teacher from Sacho suddenly found himself in the company of political heavyweights like Tom Mboya, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Ronald Ngala, etc., etc. And if the local colonial administration was expecting a group of yes-men, would bow to them, they were in for a shock. Because these initial African leaders to the Legco ended up playing a very critical role in bringing about the independence of Kenya. Much earlier than most expected. Thanks mostly to a man called Tom Mboya. And of course his lifelong political rival, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, father to Raila Odinga. Now, in order to move quickly, we shall now move across Moi's life very quickly, highlighting specific dates that were very important in his life, which will tell us more about the kind of person he was and the legacy he leaves behind. And let us start with the year 1960. Barely 5 years after some Mzungu had picked out Moi, a humble school teacher, and had picked him to be an administrator on behalf of the colonialists. There is no doubt that those 5 years must have been years of tremendous growth and learning for Moi. And so in 1960, a political party called KADU was formed. And the two founding members were a man called Ronald Ngala from the coast, the Legco representative from the coast, and Daniel Arap Moi. And again, Moi was an accidental founding member of KADU. Even if you do not have the facts, just 5 years later, barely 5 years later, it was still too early for Moi to have strong political views and inclinations. But his roots were very deeply entrenched in the church. And some people in the church were part of the colonial administration who were worried about the future of Kenya, and leaders that they saw as being too radical, like one Jomo Kenyatta. And so the colonialists heavily financed another political party to oppose KANU called KADU, Kenya African Democratic Union. And they were ready to use the influence and knowledge of the country and power to ensure that independent Kenya would be controlled and run by people they trusted, like Daniel Arap Moi and Ronald Gala. Now here's an interesting aside for you, and it has to do with our 2010 constitution. Now most were carried kicking and screaming and resisting into something called devolution. Even as the negotiations for the new constitution were going on, many Kenyans were paranoid about devolution because it sounded very similar to Majimboism, which was what was promoted by KADU. And KADU was financed by local colonialists, who were keen to ensure that the power of running the whole country would not go to one man they didn't trust, and therefore preferred federalism, Majimboism, where the power would be diluted into regions, autonomous regions in the country. And the political rhetoric used to get support from local Africans was that the whole idea was to ensure that small tribes were not swallowed by the big, influential, better educated tribes. Now I believe it is important to understand that, especially now, when we're talking about a three-tier system, introducing a regional authority over the counties. Anyway, back to Moi. So KADU stood for Majimboism, an idea that ended up being defeated by KANU. And so as the new country called Kenya was birthed, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi was in the opposition. Fast forward to 1966. The then vice president, and indeed the very first vice president of Kenya, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, had fallen out with his close ally and friend, Jomo Kenyatta. Of course, at this juncture, the party KADU did not exist. Moi and Gala and everybody else had crossed over to KANU. The country was already a de facto one-party state. And after Jaramogi resigned in a half, Jomo appointed Joseph Murumbi as Kenya's second vice president. Murumbi had been sired by a Goan father and born of a Maasai mother. Very widely traveled and exposed Kenyan. The equivalent of a Kenyan today who has lived a lot of his life in the diaspora. Maybe somewhere in the US or UK. Very patriotic and with high ideals for Kenya. And so, there was no way he would last serving the Jomo Kenyatta administration without losing his soul. And so he too resigned. And so one day, Jomo Kenyatta was inside his presidential limousine, traveling, with a man called Charles Njonjo. And they were discussing a problem, a crisis that Jomo had to sort out. Because in less than 2 years, Jomo had had 2 vice presidents resigning. Of course, under very different circumstances. One was forced into resigning, put pressure on, frustrated, etc., etc. And the other resigned on principle. And whatever people want to say about old Jomo, he was a very wise man. And therefore what he was looking for was a vice president who would stick. Somebody with no issues and somebody who they would trust. And according to Charles Njonjo, they reached a point of frustration and Njonjo started mentioning the name of every politician he could think of, while Jomo considered each name and rejected. And so as the presidential limousine was hurtling along the highway, somewhere close to Nakuru, the name of Daniel Moi came out of Charles Njonjo's mouth. And Kenyatta stopped him, and took a few minutes thinking. And then he nodded his head and said, yes, I will appoint him. And so yet again, Moi accidentally ended up being vice president of the Republic of Kenya. And so began a period of Moi's life that for all intents and purposes was a nightmare. The powerful Kiambu mafia did not want to understand and did not understand the wisdom of appointing Moi as a vice president. And he ended up being a very easy target and punching bag, in terms of ridicule and outright insults. Indeed, Moi had to learn the Kikuyu language very quickly. Why? Because quite often, as they were waiting in the cabinet room for Jomo Kenyatta to walk in, there would be chatter. Yeah? And most of the cabinet belonged to the house of Mubi. And therefore the conversation would be in Kikuyu. And quite a few times, that conversation would be insulting towards Moi, making jokes about Moi. And if as a result of this Moi dreaded cabinet meetings, which he must have, it just got worse, as the years rolled on, because the waits for Kenyatta to walk in grew longer and longer as Kenyatta's health deteriorated. And on many occasions, Jomo would not even turn up, and the cabinet meetings would be postponed. But they would be postponed after the Kiambu Mafia and some cabinet ministers had had a very good time cracking jokes about Moi in Kikuyu. But it wasn't only in cabinet meetings that Moi suffered ridicule. In one particular incident, where there was a delegation out of the country, led by the Vice President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, Foreign Affairs Minister Njoroge Mungai carried out a coup in a foreign land and took over as head of the delegation. And it was not just about the lack of respect, the madharau he had for Moi. Njoroge Mungai was very polished. Indeed, he got his medical degree from Stanford, an Ivy League university in the United States. And he felt that in this instance, Moi's heavy Kalenjin accent was portraying the country in poor light, in front of the Mzungus. Fast forward to 22nd August 1978. The country was in shock. Founding father and president of the country, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, had passed on. To many analysts, it was a miracle that Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi was still the vice president. There had been a very spirited effort to change the constitution, by some Kiambu Mafia fellows who knew that Jomo was very sickly and would pass on at any time. And therefore, starting in 1976, they wanted the constitution changed so that in the event that the president passed on, the vice president would not automatically take over in an acting capacity as the president of the Republic of Kenya. Obviously, this move was targeted at Moi. Of course, nobody saw Moi as a threat. However, the Kiambu Mafia, who were lasting, to take over the presidency, wanted to remove all possible obstacles in their way. The move failed. Jomo dismissed it with an old Kikuyu proverb that says, if you want to put a rope around the neck of a cow, you don't show it the rope until the last minute, of course. He was, of course, telling them that if their target was Moi, they were making it too obvious. And you didn't do that in politics. Other analysts still insist that had Jomo's health been better, Moi would have ended up out of the vice presidency. But the old man in the last days slipped in and out of coma so frequently that it was impossible to corner him and put him in the right frame of mind to make that decision that the Kiambu Mafia wanted. Oh yes, it was a complete miracle that Daniel Arap Moi was still vice president when Kenyatta passed on in August 1978. It is super interesting, the Time magazine, in an article analyzing the possible successors to Jomo, had a very long list, and that list did not include Daniel Arap Moi anywhere. And so once again, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi became president accidentally. Fast forward to 1st August 1982. Later that month, Moi would complete 4 years at the helm as President of the Republic of Kenya. A humble, hard-working president who, unlike Jomo, who was hardly seen in public, mingled with Kenyans at every corner of the country. Indeed, many parts of the country had never, in their entire history, hosted the President of the Republic of Kenya. But with Moi they did, several times. Now, interestingly, on 22nd August 1978, 4 years earlier, Moi had come into Nairobi in very uncomfortable circumstances. You see, a chopper had been dispatched to collect him from Nakuru and bring him back to State House, Nairobi, to take the oath as acting President of the Republic of Kenya. But Moi, fearing for his life, sent the helicopter back, and he got into Nairobi in a manner which was not known to most. But it is actually said, by some sources, that he made it back to Nairobi in the boot of an old Peugeot 404 beat-up car that he used to use on his farm. Why? In order to avoid being waylaid, to avoid roadblocks by the dreaded Ngoroko Private Army, which had been installed by the Kiambu Kitchen Mafia to ensure that Moi would not live to take the oath of office after Kenyatta passed on. Now, 4 years later, once again, Moi got back into Nairobi in very uncomfortable circumstances. This time, it is said, he was inside a tank, a military tank, in an operation that the Kenya Defense Forces called Operation Maji Machafu, Operation Dirty Waters. Security personnel had to ensure that the president, after the failed coup of 1982, would be able to get back safely into State House, without the danger of being exposed to snipers, or attacks on his way back. Because quite naturally, at that point, they didn't know how far and deep the plot to overthrow Moi was. It should also be noted that it was from this time going forward that Moi changed from the president he was before 1982 into the feared, draconian, dictatorial president that most Kenyans will remember him for. This was the period in Kenya's history when, if you are a cabinet minister or a high-ranking government official, the 1 o'clock VOK news was mandatory. The 1982 coup attempt changed Moi drastically, so that he embraced very closely Jomo Kenyatta brutal tactics to hang on to power at all costs. The methods and tactics he was so determined to unlearn as he took the oath of office in 1978, he now very closely embraced. But admittedly, in many ways, deep inside, Moi remained the same man. He still crisscrossed the country to every conceivable corner, just as he had done when he took over for the very first time as President of Kenya. And of course, very similar from the time when he was appointed by the colonialists to be administrator over the Rift Valley. He would travel right across the Rift Valley in an old beat-up Land Rover to every corner of the province, seeking to assist and enhance the lives of the people whom he had been appointed to look after. Moi still worried about the vulnerable common man. He once put enormous pressure on a well-known multinational to sack its local, very competent CEO. Reason? The company had increased the price of some basics, soap, Blue Band, etc., by a few cents. Moi as president touched the lives of many underprivileged Kenyans and changed their lives forever. Fast forward to December 30th, 2002 at Uhuru Park. The day Moi handed over power, many people didn't believe it was even happening. The day Moi handed over power to President Mwai Kibaki, Kenyans tore his portrait, some threw mud at him, and many jeered and cheered in relief as he boarded a helicopter that would fly him back to his Kabarak home, and to the sunset of Kenyan politics. They say, you don't know the good thing you have until you lose it. Barely 3 years later, Moi appeared at the burial of Jomo Kenyatta's first wife, and he was so wildly cheered with so much enthusiasm by a huge Kenyan crowd The same crowd that had jeered and celebrated when he left power now firmly embraced him, and greatly embarrassed the then President Moi Kibaki as he arrived at that function, thus fulfilling Moi's own prophecy when he told Kenyans, "Mutani kumbuka, you will remember me," as they jeered and as they were impatient for him to leave power, so that Kenya can have a new beginning. The expected new beginning for Kenyans, of course, did not take off. In fact, shortly before takeoff, that aircraft crashed and burnt. And that crowd reflected the mood of Kenyans right across the country. They were missing Moi. They were missing his humility. They were missing his concern for the common man. Kiraitu Murungi, who was then a very powerful cabinet minister in the Moi Kibaki government, had once famously said that what he wanted most was for Moi to retire to his Kabarak home and look after goats, but make sure he observed keenly how a government should be run, because Kiraitu felt they were going to show Moi a thing or two that Moi didn't know. But it was the very same Moi Kibaki administration that went desperately looking for Moi in 2005 to teach them how to run a stable government, because the Moi Kibaki presidency then was very shaky and unstable and had many challenges and problems that they could not handle on their own. They needed Moi's counsel. And so once again, accidentally, Toroitich, the son of Moi, ended up being a legend in Kenyan politics. In conclusion, whatever you think or whatever you may want to say about Moi, whatever evil you think Moi did, this one is a fact. Moi was a good man. And there's a very important lesson for Kenyans here. If such a good man as Moi ended up with the presidency and became the brutal dictator he became and did the things he did, to me it proves that the office of the President of the Republic of Kenya changes good people into bad people. In other words, it brings out the worst in people. And in my view, Moi did better than many would have done under the same circumstances. He didn't kill people. He detained them instead. And so the lesson is this. Going forward, you want to choose people who have already been known not to be good people to become president of Kenya. What do you expect? In my view, the best thing for our country going forward is to abolish this evil office. Another lesson going forward. Moi was a wise man. He had seen a lot. He went through a lot. And he stubbornly refused to host Deputy President William Samoei Ruto. In my view, that was a message from Moi to the Kenyans he always deeply cared about, despite everything. And we have to figure out what that lesson was, what he was trying to tell us. Something else I must say. The passing on of Moi's firstborn son, Jonathan Toroitich, on 19th April 2019, hit Moi very hard. In my view, Moi never recovered from it until his death in the early hours of this morning. Just do your homework and you'll note that from then on, his health just went downhill, consistently downhill. The lesson here, according to me, is that Moi's commitment to serve the public, Moi's commitment to his public, caused him to pay a very heavy price as far as his family was concerned. And the lesson here is that your family comes first. Whatever you get appointed to, whatever you rise up to be, your responsibility at the end of the day is first and foremost to your own family. You will have to answer to Almighty God for your family. I believe that Moi regretted that circumstances were such that he did not give his family the attention that he should have given them. And the rest of us Kenyans should be very grateful that we had a Kenyan, who was ready to make such sacrifices, to do his best, to do whatever he could do to take Kenya forward. Whatever happened in the end, this commitment came from Moi's heart, and that one we must recognize. Fare thee well, Toroitich, until we meet again. Until next time, this is Chris Kumekucha.